Hello everyone. Today I will be discussing The Running Grave, Book 7 of the Cormoran Strike series, written by JK Rowling under pen name Robert Galbraith, which was published on September 26th, 2023. In this review, I'd like to split up the topics into two major sections. The first will be a non-spoiler review which will inform you of what you can expect should you decide to read the book. The second section will be a review with spoilers, where I will also address the stylistic changes in her writing as the series has gone on, explain why this matters, and apply it to our latest title. Without delaying things further, let's begin. If you want my TLDR on the book without jumping in at all, I would say that The Running Grave is much better than The Ink Black Heart, and not nearly as good as Troubled Blood. The Running Grave begins with our two detectives, Cormoran Strike and Robin Ellicott, hired by civil servant Sir Colin Edinser to investigate the Universal Humanitarian Church, what Edinser believes to be a cult, for the purposes of bringing back his son, Will Edinser. Like Troubled Blood, Rowling's fifth novel, the premise for the novel begins right away, which I found quite a relief. What's more, Rowling seems so interested in this premise that she has created or stymied herself on several plot points so as to focus almost exclusively on their investigation of the cult. Robin has continued her romantic relationship with Ryan Murphy, a plot point which surfaced at the end of the previous novel and has apparently gone on for 8 months. Unlike Ink Black Heart, the agency only has one or two other side cases to distract the crew, not to mention a few minor subplots involving Strike's personal life that are opened and shut relatively quickly. No, the vast majority of the time in The Running Grave is spent on the cult. Before we move on from the premise to looking at the plot, I have to get some of the surface details out of the way. If you have made it this far into the Strike series, there are certain aspects of Rowling's writing you are likely to expect, and this book does little to change that. First, the epigraphs, which this time come from the I Ching, and I happen to believe that her use of epigraphs are nothing short of a complete waste of time. I particularly feel bad for the audiobook readers who are forced to read each and every one, whereas I simply glaze over them and go straight into the chapter. Some of the chapters in The Running Grave are barely a minute long, and yet each chapter has an epigraph. It dilutes their usefulness, and she should know that. The second thing I should mention about style is her grammatical errors. I have read many books in my life, but few are as riddled with grammar and syntax errors quite like this one. Anything from misspellings to problems choosing between two options for a sentence, resulting either in sentence fragments or run-ons. And then we have some irksome sentences that could have been rewritten for the ease of the reader's mind. They're all here. When I think of why, I have to imagine that because Rowling is a money-printing machine for a publisher, there is little to no reason to slow the publishing of each book as quickly as possible, and that means very little oversight. But if this happens often enough, and trust me, you'll see them often, you as the reader begin to have doubts about other aspects of the novel unconsciously. It should simply be a desire to publish a high-quality product that spurs them along. But as we'll discuss later in this review, Rowling's process for writing these novels has changed so precipitously that she likely has no interest in addressing these grammar errors. That to me is a problem. Moving on from surface-level features to style, many of her tics and tropes are here to stay. Robin and Strike both have a certain kind of plot armor in their own way. Strike agrees with Robin that investigating a cult from the outside is not going to provide the information they need, and so it is decided that Robin should infiltrate the cult. As you read, you can feel Rowling pulling her punches when it comes to Robin and the cult every single time anything negative could possibly occur. Of course, it's a cult, and so Robin eventually has things happen to her that we would all agree are traumatic and loathsome, worthy of a cult to be invaded, dismantled, and prosecuted to the fullest length of the law. But it is also the way that Robin both manages to stumble onto incredible pieces of evidence, as well as finagles it out of people, even to the point where she out-psychologizes a trained psychiatrist, where you start to really believe in their superhuman capabilities. Strike, on the other hand, gets into several scrapes in this book, and before you even realize what the action is that has started, it's over. Strike is just deleting people with his hands, crushing them in one punch. That made me feel like he's Batman. It's very cathartic, I'll admit, but it's also completely devoid of tension. As we'll discuss later, Rowling has sacrificed tension and anticipation in her new process, and it's easy to see in the plot armor of the two main characters. Other stylistic tropes reveal themselves. Like previous novels, there is going to be a key eyewitness who remains on the periphery until much later in the novel, one who reveals the key element which breaks the case wide open. Strike and Robin are going to be driving in the Land Rover, and they are going to get into an argument. It's just going to happen every damn book, and you're going to have to deal with it. Rowling's favorite word, incredulous, makes a comeback, but Rowling latches onto certain other words which repeat themselves in little groups throughout the novel and stick out for their repetition. In the second half, look for words like disorientated and retort, for some odd reason. Rowling's use of the appositive phrase, having unnecessary information in between two commas, is everywhere in this novel, and is even used in bizarre ways that hamper the sentence, such as when, as Colin Edinser, Strike, and Robin are going up against the case, talking about it in a restaurant, talking about the cult, Rowling goes from talking about Strike's fish order to asking a question about taking legal action to get Will out of the cult, going from an appositive to dialogue with a comma and what seems to be a new tick in her writing I haven't seen her use before. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to transition from one thought about fish to another about dialogue. So, if you thought Rowling was going to somehow come to Jesus in her style, as well as some of her tendencies with these characters, you thought wrong. Alright, now the plot. In a way, a lot of your enjoyment of the novel is going to depend on how you feel about cults. If you find cults fascinating for sociological reasons, if you find the strangeness of their history in developed nations interesting, if you find their methods haunting, lurid, and sometimes ridiculous, you owe it to yourself to read The Running Grave. For myself, I find cults a human problem which is the goal of science to unravel, and not something that appealing to history or fictionalization. Out of all the topics we've seen JK Rowling interrogate throughout her series, it is perhaps this one that I felt the least interested in. But that is, of course, a subjective opinion. In the past 5 years, we've seen a huge interest in cults as a tangent topic from true crime that has even resulted in podcasts expanding the notion of what exactly is a cult, to anything from stubborn church camps to Dolly Parton. I'm not naive in speculating that this book will be very popular among people who keep their fingers on the pulse of where the true crime genre has gone, and suffice it to say, I think Rowling does her part to keep resolutely focused on the cult in a way that will make a lot of people satisfied. What isn't satisfying, once again, is the ending. Even Troubled Blood, the book I think will likely be hailed as the best in the Rowling Strikes series, in my mind has a weaker ending than others. When considering great endings, Career of Evil and Lethal White stand out as endings for their bombastic twists, but also because of the way tension and release is built up. The Running Grave and Ink Black Heart, for what it's worth, do have violent encounters, but for some reason many of the plot developments that have gone on for hundreds of pages do not seem to coalesce very well. In many of the books previously, there's not only the pleasure of reading them, but also of the resonance they provided afterward. It feels like a satisfying completion of a mystery. But in the latest books, while my wife and I do get into page turning and hailing her books like no other author, the legacy the books leave after they are done is nowhere near what they used to be. The magic has gone, and unraveling why that happens to be the case will be explained in this spoiler section. I'll just say that the latest books, even Troubled Blood, have a real problem with resolution, and it's no different here with The Running Grave. We are getting close to the end of the non-spoiler section, so the last thing I'd like to mention before we get into the weeds is that if you do decide to take a look at this book, you will be flummoxed as to figuring out what plot beats matter over others. Not only are there so many characters, so many details, but the way the details are used over time changes drastically. Unfortunately, earning those details is not very fun or interesting. Unlike previous novels, which have large set pieces that mix things up, like the Comic-Con style gathering in Ink Black Heart or the Olympic protests in Lethal White, there are very few set pieces per se in The Running Grave. Much of the first half of this novel is bogged down in interviews. This feels exactly like what top-tier private investigators are likely to do day in and day out, but much to the reader's disappointment. The pacing, therefore, of this 950-page novel can be brutal to the reader, almost abusive. Whole chapters could have been thrown away, knowing what my wife and I know now in hindsight. In my mind, Robin's experience in the cult should not have been shown, so as to make the power of the terror of that cult made more palpable, much as how, in a horror movie, the monster is not shown. We should have been on the same side as Strike when hearing about what was going on. This would have made the novel far tighter. Long story short, I just don't believe that Rowling's style was up to the task of conveying the terror of the cult. Her writing is too bright, too expository, too journalistic. To write about the things that she does in the cult is jarring, and can sometimes come off as sterile, depending on the content. Okay, we're entering the spoiler territory, so this is your last chance to get off the train before we head into many, many details of this affair. 3, 2, 1. Okay, here we go. Before reading the novel, my wife and I went through and attempted to predict what we might see in the book. We discussed around 16 points to make predictions on, which I'd like to discuss now. When would there be a dead body? We both said yes, there would be a dead body, and my wife predicted the dead body would be halfway through the book, between pages 500 and 650. I predicted the body to be around page 250. We were both wrong, in the sense that Dayu, if we want to suggest that she is the body being investigated, does not really occur until, like Margot Bamborough in Troubled Blood, well into the book, almost near completion. So, in this way, my wife was closer and therefore right. Would someone sustain a physical injury? We based this question on Robin's scar from Career of Evil, something that would linger past the book. We both said no. Of course, this novel features a lot of psychological scars for Robin, once again, but accepting Robin's bruised face from Will striking her, or Strike's bleeding face from striking the windshield, we didn't see anything that justified a physical injury being a yes in this category. Would there be any romantic outreach from either party? My wife said no, and I said yes. And as you know, if you've read the novel, Strike shares his feelings right at the very end of the novel. So I won this one by the skin of my teeth. Once again, the way Rowling shares this information, with Strike approaching it from the guise of Charlotte's suicide letter, is one that gives her all the power, because we have no idea whether the characters will act on it. She can sit on that information forever, if she wants to. It's not definitive, but there you have it. Would there be a twist in the cult? This was the one extra diabolical thing we assumed the cult would be doing to really give it that shit status. My wife suggested cover-ups, as in helping famous people cover up past mistakes. I had human trafficking, and lo and behold, I was right on the money. As you'll see later, this is rare for the other points, but for this one, I was disappointingly right. What astounds me about this topic is how it is revealed so nonchalantly, and then relegated backstage for other matters. The elephant in the room, for Rowling's novel, is Jeffrey Epstein, as every character who happens to be contacted from the cult ends up killing themselves before they can face charges, preferably by hanging themselves with rope. Yet the information that they are hanging themselves over has little to do with child trafficking at all, but with the death of Dayu, the drowned prophet. What astounds me, I suppose, is how much the novel would not change whether this revelation about child trafficking were in the novel or not. Human trafficking has been a pet topic for the conservatives in America and the UK for the past couple of years, and so I suppose it was in Rowling's best interest to latch onto it. But very little of the book feels as though it was prepared for a reveal of this kind, and so the whole twist feels very limp, much like other revelations, which we'll come to. Would there be a side character death? My wife thought it would be health-related, and yes, there would be, while I thought yes as well, though it would be with violence. Turns out we were both right, in a way. Charlotte Campbell killed herself using violent means, but had a long history of mental health complications. I think this was a good decision for Rowling, as we needed a push for the characters in their lives to give their arc some momentum besides clearing cases. Robin's arc with Matthew was over, and were it not for the comparison between Ryan Murphy and Matthew, we would not have seen his name once. Strike, on the other hand, still has some connective tissue to a past life that he considers a mistake, not to mention that this twist felt surprising but inevitable. The writing was on the wall with Charlotte, and I thought it was effective at pushing Strike into making some decisions. What would the number of suspects be? My wife said that this book would not be that kind of book, whereas I said, hilariously, 4. My wife was clearly right. I thought that this would be a cult where a murder would happen at the time of the investigation, and so it would have ended up being a bottled mystery where only a few people could have killed the person at any given time. But this book is far less about Dayu's death, though it does come up a lot, and more concerned with several other plots arranged into a field of inquiry. I think this is a major problem with Rowling's writing, which I'll discuss after our predictions. But yeah, I was very wrong on this one. Would Strike and Charlotte get back together? Like an idiot, I said yes, whereas my wife said no. Obviously, that didn't happen. Would Strike's health come into play? We both said no, and we're both right, but we didn't predict that Strike would attempt to get his health under control to such an extent where he would lose weight. Would Robin and Strike have sex? We both said no, and we're both validated, I guess, as well as invalidated, if you know what I mean. Would a gun be fired? There have been few guns in the Strike series, and so we both said no, but little did we know that there would be a flat-out car chase with guns blazing in this book, very surprising and gaudy on Rowling's part. Would a new agency be unveiled? If you remember, in the last novel, the agency office exploded when Pat opened a package that turned out to be a bomb. I thought that this book would have the agency undergo renovations, and with their newfound popularity, the office would get an uplift. None of this happens. I was very disappointed. Would Robin be admitted into a psych ward? We both said yes, but we were underestimating just how resilient Rowling forces her characters to be, no matter what happens. Although Rowling does attempt to give us the idea that Robin was shaken in her experience in the cult, she's really fine. Totally fine. And still quite effective in her role as an investigator as soon as she's back out. Very shocking for having been in there for 4 months, let me tell you. Sarah Shadlock's new baby would not be Matthew's. A totally off-base prediction. Neither of these characters are in the novel, so let's move on. What would be the love interest problem for Robin? We all know Ryan Murphy is not endgame, so what would be the thing to keep them apart? I suggested a lot of free advice, as Murphy would try to include himself in the investigation as an undesired third party. My wife said something similar. Turns out it was just good old-fashioned jealousy. I happen to think that Ryan Murphy is simply a plot device, a way for Rowling to put the romance on ice so as to focus completely on the casework. In that way, I see now that any characterization from Murphy is unnecessary. He is a function, and not really a character worth discussing. And those were our predictions. For this last section, I'd like to try and talk about what Rowling is doing with her writing, and how it helps to explain our latest disappointments in the series. This is going to get into the weeds, so I hope you'll bear with me. For years, Rowling has touted herself as an author who pre-plans with meticulous detail, and is so desperate to be viewed in this way that she has overindulged on this idea on Twitter, where she frequently revealed that she knew exactly the skin tone of Hermione Granger, or what Hogwarts students happen to be Jewish. It is natural in a world so compellingly drawn up as the wizarding world that fans would want to embellish it with their own stories and ideas, but Rowling seems desperate to beat them to the punch. If I've learned anything from Rowling's past 2 Strike novels, it is that it obliterates this idea. Rowling, like many other authors, writes her way through a story. That sounds obvious, but while some authors use note cards, and others make maps or timelines, and genre fiction especially, some authors start with nothing, and write whatever comes to their heads. I have been taking a look at Rowling's output in the Strike series, and I think the results have been illuminating. We're going to use some math now, so I apologize up front, but I think it's worth exploring. I counted the months in between each Strike release, and then I took the page count and divided the amount of pages into the months to determine a page-to-month ratio. I do understand that this is not very accurate. After all, a book is finalized long before it is published, because a lot of work goes into the cover design, the layouts, typesetting, printing, taking pre-orders, and so on. But I do think this ratio is helpful for our purposes here. We cannot really say with accuracy what a ratio would look like for Cuckoo's Calling, but it is the second shortest book at 464 pages. The second novel, The Silkworm, had a gap of 14 months and is 454 pages, giving us a ratio of 32 pages a month. The gap between it and The Career of Evil was 15 months, and with a page count of 512 pages, gives us a 34-page-a-month ratio. 3 years separated Career of Evil and Lethal White, likely due to her efforts screenwriting the Fantastic Beasts series, so we get a ratio of 18 pages a month, as Lethal White was 656 pages. Troubled Blood was written in 2 years, giving us a ratio of 39 pages a month. Ink Black Heart was written 1 month short of 2 years, and was 1,024 pages, giving us a ratio of 44 pages a month. The Running Grave was written in 13 months, and at 960 pages, we have a whopping 73 pages a month for a ratio. Again, remember, books are finished long before they are published, so this ratio could actually be skewed higher if we knew what to expect. Let's table that for now, and talk about how Rowling changes her series as she's writing them. We all can feel the difference in the Harry Potter series when we go from the first 3 novels, which are all about adventures within Hogwarts, to the last 4 books, which feel like a continuation of a larger plot involving the evil Voldemort. We all know deep down that once Cedric Diggory dies, the tone and subject matter of Harry Potter takes a decisive turn. This too happened in the Strike series. In the first 3 novels, you get the sense as the reader that these stories have a distinct case for Strike and Robin, and a peripheral context that, while it matters, does not take over the story. In The Cuckoo's Calling, they investigate a supposed suicide that does happen to Madeline's celebrity, but only a tangential amount. The same goes for The Silkworm, which happens to be embedded into the book publishing world, but is mostly about the author, Coin, and the enemies he made along the way. Career of Evil may delve into Strike's past, but is mostly about identifying one of 3 or 4 possible suspects as a serial killer. Now, Lethal White is the goblet of fire in this metaphor, and is very much the transitional book in the series. Lethal White has its hands in both cookie jars. It is about Chisel's family, but it is also about a political history as well, digging into a past and dispersing a lot of that investigative energy into other pieces of a larger puzzle. Lethal White, in my mind, is her strangest novel so far, not only because of the large gap separating this book from the others, but because of the subject matter. Troubled Blood was written far faster and with totally different notions in mind. Here's how it changed. JK Rowling went from writing about particularities to writing about fields. When writing about a particular case, all sorts of problems arise. Rowling has to be meticulous and form a timeline. Rowling has to manage to keep Strike and Robin investigating, rather than a police force. She needs to keep modern technology out, and needs to maintain consistency throughout a very short period of time. All of these things can cause writer's block. I happen to think that Rowling likes the process of writing so much that she has changed her scope and scale to allow her to write freely. To do this, she has to write in fields. Let's take Troubled Blood, for instance. Troubled Blood is a cold case, taking us back across decades of history. This gives Rowling a lot of leeway, and along the way she was able to write about feminism in the latter half of the 20th century, and motherhood, 2 topics that she feels she is an expert at, and that she feels strongly towards. In that way, she managed to align the best of all her possible styles and knowledge sets, and created a novel that I happen to think could be read independently of the series and be just fine. Each day, Rowling sits down to write, and while people like to think that she has a particular idea in mind, I think these latest novels reveal that she either never did, or has decided against that now. Really, she simply writes details and ideas with such a wealth of information that what she eventually has is a large menu, where she can pick out what information matters when she picks up the pen the next day. This is why the size of her novels has ballooned so widely. Like a sculptor, she is simply getting material out there that she can mold. This is a very different style from the first novels, which were more contained and more challenging for Rowling, because in those novels, any added detail could be a mistake that introduces a conflict to the core case. So, Rowling needs to create a method to spread out the narrative. In the past, Rowling has used the meta-narrative in the form of a second book, whether it be a biography of Albus Dumbledore, or Margot Bamburgh's disappearance, or a novel entitled Bombyx Mori, so as to maintain this diffusion of narrative elements. Recently, Rowling has replaced that with writing in fields. In Ink Black Heart, we get a huge redundancy of information when we have the parallel worlds of reality in the video game that Anomie happens to lead. In The Running Grave, we have the blending of one field, a cult, with a cold case that no one knew was there in the death of Dayu. Remember that the novel started with hiring Strike and Robin to get Will out. Hilariously, Will gets himself out. Sure, we can say that Robin helped Will, but Robin herself admits that Will was going to get out because of his own doubts, as well as the failing health of Lin, his lover, and mother of Ching, his child. This makes The Running Grave the only book so far where the resolution of the book and the solving of the mystery has nothing to do with what they were hired for. What we are seeing now is Rowling's first drafts. Whereas before, her writing was far more distilled and planned, these later novels are what happens when you see an author trying to figure out the story as she goes along. In this way, there are bound to be trade-offs, and one of those is the lack of anticipation and tension. Robin randomly spots a set of pictures in the barn, Will randomly leaves the cult, and the killer hardly if ever feels earned. Imagine that Rowling is simply writing out all of these details, and like a player cheating at cards, she has all the winning hands. She has a deck with 4 aces of spades, and at any moment she can pull out an ace whenever she wants, in the form of a tiny detail that seemed innocuous, but actually turned out to really matter. Throughout the story, there are a set of highly graphic Polaroid pictures. For the longest time, the reader believes that the context for the pictures could only be one way, but at the end of the running grave, you find out that the rationale for the pictures was far different. It wasn't a punishment, it was a club of people, an inner group, and pig masks end up being the deciding factor. So Rowling not only gets to reveal information as she likes, she gets to change the context for the information at any given moment. The characters being in pig masks are not for the reader, but for the writer, because we cannot be too sure who these people are. Only Rowling knows until the bitter end. This makes our attempts at detection very difficult, nigh impossible. If you aren't quite getting what I mean here when I talk about the length of these novels and their subject matter serving Rowling, let's contrast these books with the works of Agatha Christie's. When Hercule Poirot has his big reveal at the end of each mystery, yes, he reveals who did it, but he also does something that is just as important, if not more so, which is that he reveals who could not have done it. This is why so many characters in Poirot stories force an alibi in a particular moment, so as to make themselves look innocent. In her contained mysteries, this negation, this ability to discern who could have done it with who could not possibly have done it, is vitally important. This negative space used to be present in Rowling's earlier mysteries, as the context was far more narrow. Only a handful of people really knew Strike in his past to be a killer haunting him. The trick was singling him out against the others in Career of Evil. But in these latest novels, Rowling has written investigations that make these largely beside the point. That is why Ink Black Heart and The Running Grave seem to be so disappointing. Knowing who did it, as opposed to those who could not have done it, feels like it is not the reason for reading these novels anymore. The reveal that Abigail was in fact the one who orchestrated Dayu's death was a case of too little too late, because by then, so many other plot points had come to pass that it was simply a consolation prize. Rowling's decisions and her writing style have all been to her benefit. No longer is she obligated to write tightly paced and narrow mysteries, which force her to stick to a smaller subset of characters, so as to provide reasons for some suspects against others. Now she writes in a context where she is writing hefty first drafts and can turn the story at her bidding, but the end result is that plots do not land. Why on earth did Robin just happen to find amazingly incriminating evidence inside of a chocolate biscuit tin in a dark barn amid a huge pile of other garbage? Why is the cult obsessed with hoarding incriminating evidence when they should have just burned everything, or at the very least fed it to the pigs? On the other hand, why were we not foreshadowed of the possibility of child trafficking all the way until the very, very end, when we are simply told it's a thing that the cult does? What was the story that Isaac Mills gave at the very end? It's told to us secondhand, as Strike reveals Carrie's story to Abigail. Along the way, people like Walter Fernsby are left in the dust. In another iteration of this novel, you might have expected the Fernsby family to matter a great deal. By the end, I still couldn't figure out exactly how Philippa and Nicholas Delaunay were implicated in the mystery of Dayu's disappearance. In another draft of this novel, I could just as easily see Nicholas killing Kevin Pirbright, just as Strike imagined, given his ex-military background and short temper. When Rowling writes in Fields, she gives herself a buffet of options. The latest books don't feel tight. That's basically all I'm saying. Imagining different possibilities for these books is not a good thing, and it all comes down to Rowling's lacking desire to take her time, go into a new draft, and cut the corners of the investigation into something that allows for only one possibility, for there to be build-up, anticipation, tension, and then resolution and release. She just likes writing, and she enjoys pumping out these behemoth novels at such lengths, no matter the cost to the reader's eyes. Don't get me wrong, for some moments of this novel, I enjoyed it, and I read these 950 pages quite fast. But now that I know what Rowling is doing, it makes me upset that she gets to have all the fun, holding all the cards, and playing them whenever she feels like. Sometimes it can take hundreds of pages for her to realize what her story is about. That feels aggravating. Anyways, I hope this story articulates for you what you may like and not like about The Running Grave. I totally expect her to have a novel ready by September of next year, and for it to be another giant novel of 900 pages, and for Robin and Strike to not come together romantically yet again. It's hard for a writer to turn away from their own worst desires, and I think Rowling has stepped resolutely into this territory. Thanks for listening.